Okay, so welcome everybody to another EA Zoom meeting. This is about Capricorn Cazimi, Venus in the heart of the Capricorn Sun with both Saturn and Pluto. And as I'm talking right now, we actually also have Mercury in Saturn. We have Mercury in Capricorn conjoining Saturn. But this is mostly focused on the really amazing alignment we had earlier this week of Venus and the Sun with Pluto, which is even more powerful with, they weren't aligned by degree with Saturn, but the fact that Saturn is also home in its own sign of Capricorn makes it all the more powerful. So we're going to talk about what this means. I'm going to go through some technical information. And then I'd also like to, if people want to, at different points, I think I'm just going to stop and see if people have anything from their personal lives they'd like to share, just to hear some different experiences from different people, how they've been experiencing this transit. If you don't want to share anything, that's totally fine. So what we just had was, it's called the superior conjunction of Venus with the Sun. This is when Venus is on the far side of the Sun from us in orbit, and I'll go a little bit more into detail about that. It happened again this previous Monday on January 8th. It was at basically 19 degrees of Capricorn, and Pluto was also at 19 degrees of Capricorn at the same time. There's a phenomenon of this with Venus with going into the Sun. It's called Cazimi, or being in the heart of the Sun, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But basically, you know, we had a complete alignment of Venus, Sun, Pluto, all together, basically all starting a cycle together at the same time. And so I'll just kind of right at the beginning, I don't know if anybody has anything they'd like to share about this. You know, basically a week ago is not too bad. Any kind of more recent events of things that kind of unfolded in this past week. If anybody does, feel free to jump in right now. And if not, I'll kind of move on in a moment here.
I have something that's just kind of a general thing. You all may have heard about the fires in Santa Barbara County, and then the night of that triple conjunction was when the mudslide happened in Santa Barbara County, which is like probably the biggest mudslide that has ever happened here anyway, and killed so far 17 people and covered like something like 35 square miles or something. Anyway, that all came into a supercell of rain, went through one of the richest areas in Santa Barbara County, and loosened up all of the soil that had been made bare by the fires. And this wall of water just went through the whole town.
Yeah, and do you live in that area or not too far from it?
I used to live there. I live about 50 miles from there now. And
Okay.
yeah, so it's I have friends in the area.
Yeah, I saw that on the news. Yes, that's definitely one of the most dramatic, traumatic things that I saw coming about with that. And yeah, and that's one of the things about this alignment. It's not the normal Venus-Sun thing happening, because we have Pluto involved at the same time. And although, you know, we often have very positive experiences with Pluto, a lot of times it's very destructive things happening with those types of transits. It can be really difficult.
Yeah, and at the same time was the Mars Jupiter conjunction.
Yeah,
Which,
exactly.
you know,
At the same time.
yeah, and they were in, you know, sextile to each other. It just seemed
Mhm.
like it was just earth, water and earth. I mean, just horrendous amounts of water and earth.
Yeah. Yeah, that image of the mudslide, there's definitely something that seems a little Pluto about that. I was thinking that when I saw it. I haven't been able to follow that story too closely, but
Yeah.
I did see that and hear about it.
Well, it happened exactly as it was forming exactly as that aspect came into
Yeah,
fruition.
that's amazing. Yeah, I hadn't followed it that closely to realize it was exactly lined up with that, but I thought it was happening at about the same time. Yeah. Does anybody else have another example of something, or even anything you just noticed in the news? There's one news thing that seemed very lined up with it that I could talk about if nobody else has something. But
I could just add that I saw Oprah Winfrey, who lives in that area, and her
All right.
son is 21 Capricorn, and her 65 acres are being used to stage and rescue and search for the people. And because I wondered, when I saw her on the news, I thought, I know she's a Capricorn, and there it is, 21 Capricorn, and all that happened right beside her, but her 65-acre estate was spared. So I'm just sharing that.
So Oprah's estate was spared, but did you say Oprah's been used her estate for something with the?
Yeah, to stage for helicopters to land. She had 65 acres. They could land there.
Wow.
Yeah, isn't that interesting that happened on her son?
That is really interesting. Well, I was actually going to mention Oprah. See, I haven't been following it that closely, that news story, to even know that had happened with Oprah. The one thing with Oprah I was thinking about was her speech at the Golden Globes, which got so much media attention, which I just remember waking up on Monday just knowing this was going on, and I was just seeing all this stuff being shared about Oprah and her speech and everything. And if you watch that speech, it very much completely seemed to capture so many different elements of this alignment. So yeah, I was thinking about Oprah on that point. But that's even more interesting. I didn't realize she was also connected to the mudslide thing at the same time. So she was literally just all over that transit. Actually, a friend of mine, I know some of y'all are from Australia on here, and I have a Australian friend named Cassandra Tyndall, who's a little more traditional astrologer. I noticed actually today or maybe yesterday, she posted something. She has an astrology blog, and she actually wrote about this alignment directly about that Golden Globes speech that Oprah gave, and I thought made some really good observations about that. And I had thought the same thing because I kept hearing people talk about it or posting about it. So then I eventually watched the speech too. Later, and some of the things. Obviously, with that speech, with that idea of this like new age, like this kind of new cycle happening that she was kind of talking about. This is like a new era. And it was all about this empowered women, speaking out and sharing their voice. That aspect of it is a kind of a very literal, Venus in the heart of the sun, and Venus kind of being on the solar throne and really empowered, as far as Venus being aligned with women and issues of femininity and feminism. And another part of it that was very kind of Plutonic, and I think also goes along pretty well with Capricorn from the evolutionary astrology standpoint, just of conditioning and civilization, which often involves oppression and racism and how we get conditioned to look at things. Another part of her speech, and Cassandra if you read her article, she talks about this too. She described or when she was a young girl, seeing Sidney Poitier win the very same award, and just how that kind of blew her mind to see this Black man, held up with who's a very noble personality, but just him getting this award, and just how that kind of changed her mind and ability to perceive herself and perceive the world, and kind of what's possible and the potential. And then how she was also simultaneously recognizing now she was standing on the same stage, and there are young girls out in the audience watching her that would be having that potentially that same realization from watching her. So there's something about that's just a very literal manifestation of what we're talking about with this transit. And with the mudslides and a lot of the other really traumatic, difficult things in the news cycle we're hearing about, with things just falling apart in society, and all these struggles and difficulties we're facing, that's another aspect that we're seeing with this, that that aligns with Pluto and Capricorn, especially the way it gets used in evolutionary astrology. And then further thing I'll work into this eventually also is this was all happening. This is all part of Pluto coming across its own south node. So the south node of Pluto is getting activated this year. So this Venus Sun Pluto thing was basically on the south node of Pluto. And we're heading towards eventually Saturn making its way towards Pluto, which is also, and that conjunction is going to be happening additionally it's going to involve the south node of Saturn right at the same time. So yeah, this idea of I'll just move on actually, unless there's something else. There's another example people would want to share. I don't know if there's any other example anyone would want to share about anything they noticed just this past week. Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead then. So yeah, here's a chart just of, which kind of pulls in some of the stuff Sue was sharing there. So yeah, you can see the Venus-Pluto is pretty much right at 19 degrees. Pluto's only a few minutes past 19 degrees. So when they exactly aligned, they're only about 7 minutes away from Pluto. So we got Venus immediately going on and applying to a conjunction with Pluto, and then the Sun immediately applying to a conjunction with Pluto. And as was mentioned, this is happening at the same time that Mars and Venus are forming the crescent or waxing sextile. Venus is applying to that aspect. And there's a little bit of reception there because Venus is in the exaltation of Mars in Capricorn. So yeah, it's just amazing. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, but the fact that this Venus-Mars cycle that we're in right now is really pretty incredible with where it's going in the year ahead. And that when we hit this waxing sextile moment, we have Mars aligned with Jupiter and Scorpio, and Venus and the Sun and Pluto all completely aligned in Capricorn. And what made this even more just kind of catalytic and really impactful is the moon, because this was also all happening with the last quarter moon forming. And when the last quarter moon was hitting, Venus was receiving the moon in that last quarter square. And when we actually hit the moment of them actually all, Venus and the Sun actually aligning by the minute, at that moment, the moon's very tightly applying to an opposition with Uranus. So, yeah, for example, with the mudslide thing, I think that goes with it really well. With that last quarter moon aspect, just kind of amplifying things in that way. That also goes really well with the more positive Oprah manifestation of her talking about this, the ability of someone's perception or awareness to transform and, just kind of get this idea that, inspiring other people to rise above oppressive social conditions, to live out their dream more fully. That idea getting opened up would be the positive way you could see some of this playing out. So I have on here this idea of the Venus Capricorn Cazimi. So one thing I want to make sure I spend a little time talking about is just, what is that actually? And why is that held important in astrology? I'm sure a lot of you already know about that. I know it's also not something that's it's talked about kind of in a different way. Certainly conjunctions and when things are applying to conjunct are held to be important in evolutionary astrology. And the sun, just like in most systems, is definitely seen as like your sole purpose within Jeff Green's work with evolutionary astrology. But these types of terms like Cazimi and being in the heart of the sun, I know aren't usually talked about. So I'm just going to provide a little bit of background information about how this gets used by, it's a little bit more of a traditional type of astrology technique. So the term Cazimi, it goes back to some Arabic terms that basically mean as being like as if in the heart. The first record, at least that I'm aware of, and this is me getting my information mostly from Chris Brennan and other people that have been working on bringing a lot of the Hellenistic material forward, is apparently Rhetorius, who was he's often called Rhetorius the Egyptian. You'll sometimes hear he was a Hellenistic astrologer, kind of end of the 6th, beginning of the 7th century. He used a Greek term which basically translates as being in the heart. And he said this was a situation that would happen when a planet was within 1 degree of the sun, and that this was something that the planet was seen as actually being strengthened and not weakened. And this is an important distinction, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. But traditionally in astrology, planets being really close to the sun, unless under certain conditions, were often not seen as being at, not sort of basically they're often seen as being weakened in some way or not at full strength. The way I've kind of come to interpret that, and a lot of people interpret it, is this idea of sort of a purification process going on as a planet's kind of coming close to the sun. But when a planet's close to the sun, you can't see it. So there's no way to visually see the planet in the sky. And that's one of the fundamental reasons. But Rhetorius, and when he writes this down, he kind of mentions this is not mentioned by a lot of the ancients, but I have found, within 1 degree of the sun that the planet is strengthened. And then this idea was picked up later. And in the medieval time period, Bonatti and others, he's not the only one. It got moved down to more like a 16 minute orb. You'll see other people like William Lilly, and anybody that practices astrology in the tradition of Lilly. I believe he used like a 17-minute orb. And I think I might have even seen it as like a 15-minute orb somewhere. But that part of that is they're obviously cutting that 30-degree mark in half. And I think there's some visual element of that with by the minutes of what that supposedly looks like, that they thought that was a better way to imagine a planet, being in the heart of the sun. But it's that idea that the planet's going into the sun is being regenerated within the heart of the sun. And it's seen as sort of the planet becomes very strengthened. It's like when it's in the heart of the sun, the old analogy would be it's sitting on the throne. It's in this seat of power. All the significations of that planet would be strengthened during that passage of time of it uniting with the sun. This other term of being under the beams of the sun, that has traditionally been seen as about a 15-degree marker, but that's a very idealized number because not all planets are actually invisible at that 15-degree point. But it does on a practical level work out to be pretty good, where if a planet is 15 degrees away from the sun on either side, you're going to be able to see it. The planet's 15 degrees ahead of the sun, you're going to be able to see it as an evening star. So when the sun's setting, if a planet is 15 degrees behind the sun, you're going to be able to see it in the morning as a morning star before the sun rises from certain locations. For certain planets, this range is when they're actually visible, might be a little bit more like 11 or 12 or 13 degrees. And but that's the basic idea. And so, a lot of the whole meaning of astrology is very much based on, the sun was seen as the source of soul. It's a source of light for our solar system, right? So all the planets are receiving that light and reflecting it back to us. And the moon was associated with the material world and things passing and going, and our bodies, because the moon, is receiving that light of the sun, reflecting it back to us, which is basically the same idea. It's a very similar symbolic idea that when you hear like in evolutionary astrology, the moon is like the ego. It's like the incarnated soul in the moment, in the material world in the moment, where you are right now. So when the planet is returning to be with the sun again, it's basically returning to, by zodiac degree, its source of light. And when it enters that heart of the sun, it's like it's being regenerated. So there's that idea that when it's approaching it, it's sort of this like purifying, regenerative process where it might be a little bit weakened. One thing I think about that is if you kind of think about being like a hot springs or a sauna, or something where you're kind of burning things off a little bit, or some other situation you can imagine in that way. There's something where it's not like you're necessarily like weak, but you're in kind of a different place. You're in this sort of liminal transitory, something's getting released from you. There's a difference with interpreting planets when, they're clearly visible. Something that's clearly out ahead of the sun and you can see it. When a planet is closer to the sun, it's almost like it's kind of a little bit more consumed by the sun. And so it might not be as clear to the person always. There's one thing that this period was always interpreted as being really great for, would be doing something that's secret or hidden. And it often was also associated with things that are more internal. And there's another term you'll see sometimes, which is like combust. And you'll see that maybe like 8.5 degrees, 8 degrees away from the sun. That's sort of like that's even more intense than under the beams. There's another phenomenon, though, in Hellenistic astrology called a planet being in its chariot. And this was seen as a way to interpret planets being really close to the sun, but actually having a lot of not becoming so overwhelmed, having its full strength, basically being protected, sort of like riding in a chariot. But in this case, we're kind of talking about, the sun as a chariot, and the planet's kind of riding in the sun's chariot, but it's protected. It's not being so burned up by its union with the sun. So this would extend beyond that idea of just a planet being, in the heart of the sun for that shorter window of time. This idea of a planet being in its chariot, you could extend out to that, more like 8 degree or closer conjunctions with the sun. So Porphyry, Rhetorius were a couple of the people that talked about this. And now, so any planet in its own domicile, in its own exaltation, or in its own bounds. Bounds you'll sometimes hear called the terms of a planet. And I know some of you that might not be something that you typically look at, but the bounds actually show up in some really interesting ways in some of the older techniques where you see they must have been something people were really looking at. And if you start playing around with them, I would just go to whatever internet search engine you use. I would recommend typing in the Egyptian bounds. There's another system of bounds and terms that Ptolemy came up with that a lot of people don't really know where he got it from. And then some later people kind of adopted Ptolemy's terms because they thought Ptolemy knew everything and he was the best person. But when people have been going back kind of looking at stuff, there's another system called the Egyptian bounds, which is slightly different. And that's what I've been working with myself. And they're very interesting. It's not completely clear why they are what they are, but basically certain degrees of each sign are given to one of the 5 planets. So it's almost sort of like little rooms of degrees within that sign. So instead of the entire sign of Capricorn being Saturn and the domicile of Saturn and the exaltation of Mars, certain degree ranges are in the bounds of Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, or Saturn. And when a planet is in its own bounds, it's sort of like there's some work for that planet to do there. It kind of opens up the range of how you interpret things, and so I'm not going to go into right here, but they're very interesting to look at. And so the bounds actually show up, like I'm saying, as one of these other signs of why a planet's in its chariot and protected. So Venus is in her chariot. Anytime she's close to the sun in Taurus, her domicile, Libra, domicile, Pisces, the exaltation of Venus. And in Capricorn, the Egyptian bounds range from 14 to 22 degrees of Capricorn. So right now, Venus is actually just barely left the bounds because crossing over that 22 marker kind of meant Venus was leaving the bounds. But in that 14 to 22 degree range, Venus is there. And that was something about this that I was kind of, this is something that you might look at in a natal chart. I've been curious about just how this plays out, following transits and seeing how it works out. And the idea here would be that even beyond this little window of the actual Venus being in the heart of the sun, when Venus was in that 14 to 22 degree range, there's something about Venus being even more kind of empowered and more in its own element. It would mean that the sun, Venus, and Pluto were all in the bounds of Venus. So like if you were born with Venus in this range of 14 to 22 degrees, you would actually have Venus in its own bounds, which kind of lends itself to a little bit more of a natural expression of Venus for you, perhaps. And to me, what this means is that there is something even more Venusian, something more Venus that was really available with this transit, which at the same time is different because of Pluto being there at the same time. Pluto being in there with the Venus and the sun really does change that dynamic in a much more intense way. But there's a couple other elements when you look at essential dignity. One thing with triplicity or the elements, Venus really actually likes the earth signs. Venus is seen as a nocturnal planet, and Capricorn is seen as a nocturnal sign also. Venus also the triplicity ruler of the earth signs. And so there's something there with just like the sign and element of Capricorn 2 is a sign and element that Venus is seen as being, having a natural affinity basically for within astrology. So again, this is the chart. And the other thing about this that was really powerful was the fact that Saturn is in its own sign of Capricorn. And as we already mentioned, Mars and Jupiter combining in Scorpio and forming a sextile. And now it's even more, we got even more of a Capricorn thing going on because Mercury right now is back in Capricorn and applying to the conjunction with Saturn, which actually takes us back to the Mercury retrograde we went through at the end of December, where it started with Mercury stationing with Saturn and it's separated away from it. Now we've got Mercury's come all the way back through all those degrees. We went through retrograde in Sagittarius, and now it's back to uniting with Saturn again. So there's also something about that that's kind of getting completed and progressed forward at the same time. The thing about the superior, also called the exterior conjunction of Venus, that's just important to realize, again, is that this is when Venus is on the other side of the sun from us. So whenever you see Venus going into the heart of the sun and Venus is moving direct, you know, you can know in your head, in Venus's orbit, that it's on the far side of the sun from us. When Venus is retrograde and going into the heart of the sun, which is known as the interior or the inferior conjunction of Venus, that's always when Venus is in between us and the sun. There's a book called The Light of Venus by Adam Ginsberg, where he goes through all these different phases. And I have some of the text here from what he calls this phase, which he calls it the transmutation phase. And in his book, he's somebody that sees this superior conjunction of Venus as really being more like the midpoint of the cycle, and sees the retrograde conjunction with the sun is more like the beginning. And there's sort of a debate among astrologers about that and which one should it be. But it is pretty clear traditionally that it was seen as actually the other one, as the superior conjunction beginning it, and that being defined that way. But this is something that a lot of people have brought up. Well, maybe that we should look at this as being the beginning. The one thing about it, I've actually gone back in my life and even looked at when these things all happened, and I could kind of create a story almost either way. There's very clearly things beginning at each of these unions, and it's almost interesting when you start looking at one as the beginning of the cycle and the other one as the midpoint, and then you flip it. The story maybe slightly changes a little bit the way you're interpreting it, but it does seem to really go together. I actually personally have been the more I've opened my mind to the superior conjunction being the beginning, because most of the people I feel like I read about initially agreed with Adam Ginsberg on this, and I kind of had in my mind that that's the beginning of the cycle. And the more I've kind of opened my mind to the other one being the one we just had, being the actual beginning, the more sense it's actually made to me. At this one we're at right now, and seeing this as the actual beginning of the Venus cycle, one thing about that's interesting, it's a very delayed reveal of Venus. We're not going to see Venus again until March. And we'll see her again then as an evening star. And so we'll kind of see her emerge in the night sky again. And there's a little bit about this where it doesn't even matter to me, because either way you look at this, each time Venus aligns with the sun, she's really being reborn. And I don't really do anything where, to me, it matters so much which one is the beginning or the end, because I don't do a whole lot of like horary astrology or those types of things. But just to kind of have it out there, there is some debate about which one is really the beginning of the Venus cycle. I like the way Adam Ginsberg worked with this phase, and this idea of this forming a foundation of open-hearted power and contributing to a transformed society. And this quote here I have on the bottom, it's a little bit hard for me to actually read it the way my screen is, but I'm assuming that all of you can see it. And one of the things I like about the language he's using here is this idea of it really kind of like being this ending, kind of letting yourself open up to whatever fears you might have about what might be passing away right now. And this idea of, this force of love and being opening again to love, expressing that to people, kind of coming out of a period of a feeling of isolation, because this has been a period of time where we haven't been able to see Venus. We haven't seen Venus since really like November. Venus is at this point of its cycle, there's a long, because they move so close together, the Venus and the sun, their speed is so similar. It takes Venus a really long time to pass the sun at this place. Whereas when Venus is moving retrograde, backwards through the zodiac, Venus can kind of pass the sun a little quicker and get away from it so we see it again. But in this phase, it's a much more drawn out period of time where we don't have the light of Venus. We can't see Venus. But it's a period where, Venus is reborn now, and we know it's on its way again. And it's a really interesting timing again with this being in the northern hemisphere, the period of darkness where we just had the Capricorn solstice, which is the winter solstice here. But as far as the southern hemisphere, it's another peak time of light. But anyway, it's just kind of an interesting thing that shows up there from a northern hemisphere perspective, with it also being like this dark time for us. So this is the 5-pointed star that Venus forms in its orbit. As you probably know, these are the points where Venus is stations retrograde and forms its inferior interior conjunctions. It's also the same points where Venus forms its superior conjunction with the sun, which you just went through. So we're up at the top of this star, up in that Capricorn one right now. And if you move counterclockwise to the left towards Aries, that would have been about 9 months ago. We had the inferior retrograde conjunction of Venus and Aries. Now we're at the Capricorn point, and about 9 months or so later from now, in October, we're going to have Venus go retrograde in Scorpio. So we're next moving on to that Scorpio point. The last time we actually had a superior conjunction of Venus like we just had was actually back in 2016 in June, and that was in Gemini. And there's an interesting thing that I'm sure most of y'all know about already, but this idea of the timing of Venus, which is really magical and incredibly structured and kind of clockwork, where it shows up in these same places almost to the date, almost to the same degree. So basically every 8 years we have the superior conjunction happen in the same place, and every 8 years we have the exterior superior conjunction happen in the same place. And then it's also happening at the same time in alternating years. So every 4 years we're having it happen, the opposite one happening in the same place. So the last time we had one in Capricorn was around January 11th so again, this one was January 8th. So we go 4 years ago to January 11th. That was Venus retrograde in Capricorn in the heart of the sun, about 22 Capricorn. If we go 8 years ago, January 11th of 2010, that was the last time we had a superior or exterior conjunction of Venus, just like now, also at that 22 Capricorn place. If we go 4 years before that, that was the previous retrograde conjunction of Venus, January 13th of 24 Capricorn, and you go 4 years before that in 2002, pretty much the same day, pretty close, same degree. So you can see there's a little bit of drift across time, where it's slowly moving a couple of degrees back each time, moving a day or two back each time. And one thing you can do is kind of look at your life and see if this makes sense to you at all as far as events go. And some people seem to be a little bit more dialed into some of the more specific ones than others. Another thing is, while it's important and helpful, I think, to go back and look at, say, like what was going on in 2014 or what was going on for you in 2010, you're obviously also a totally different person now. There were totally different transits going on around this thing at the same time. But oftentimes people's personal life narratives can really kind of pop, and things can often really seeming to really show up with some of these. So I don't know if anybody here knows just from their own personal experience, if they've looked at this one before, and if you know if this particular Venus, so it's kind of like an Aquarius. If you go farther back, it'll be a little bit more into the Aquarius place, because we could keep going, 8 years back, forever. But I don't know if anybody has anything they'd want to share just about their own life, if you've noticed anything line up with this. And if not, it's okay. We can move on.
I just wanted to say real quickly that the January 11th, 2014 Venus, that conjunction, that retrograde was very significant for me. It took place in my 5th house. I don't have any planets in the 5th, nor in the 11th house, but that one was very significant.
Yeah. Are any of the other ones also, or not? Nothing else jumping out?
Well, maybe the 2002, but that would have been like several months. There were events that happened much later in 2002 that probably would coordinate with that.
Yeah. And this one would it would still have the same thing where that 2002 one, for example, would be similar to this year, where we would have gone from that into a later Scorpio retrograde, like we're going to do this year. That January, that 2014 Venus retrograde really was powerful, and that one actually also was lined up with Pluto. When Venus was stationing direct, it was in range of a conjunction to Pluto. So it wasn't the same thing as like this Venus in the heart of the sun with Pluto, but that retrograde phase and transit did also connect in with Pluto in Capricorn, that was a powerful one for me. So going back again to that chart, one of the other things I really wanted to mention was, again, about Saturn being in Capricorn. This is the idea that, wherever planets are in a sign, you always want to look at the ruler of that sign. Where is that planet? Where's the ruler of the sign? What's going on with it? Is it in a good place? Is it, what's happening with it? And in this case, Saturn is in Capricorn. And back at the solstice, we had the really amazing alignment, of Saturn going into Capricorn, and then right after that, the sun goes into Capricorn right on the solstice, and Saturn was in the heart of the sun, and Saturn got regenerated. So all of the significations that we can associate with Saturn that we would bring to this alignment in Capricorn happening anyway, they're just much, much, much more intensified. So, for example, just issues around needing to be responsible, needing to be accountable for things, maybe going through difficult things, but learning compassion out of that, needing to really face natural cycles of change and, things passing away that we have to really, let go of. Whereas at the same time, there might be new kind of exciting things that we really want to create and we need to put a lot of hard work into. So all these types of things are just even more intensified due to the fact that Saturn's in Capricorn. And I think it really, even though there's a lot of difficult things going on personal levels, to me it really brings in a huge potential of a lot of growth, a lot of really tangible, practical, real progress you can make in whatever kind of directions you're being called to create and develop things right now. With Saturn Capricorn, just to me makes that even more powerful. The thing with the Venus and Mars cycle is that we're now in this waxing crescent phase, like we mentioned. And this cycle they're in right now goes back to October. We had that full moon in Aries, and they unite in Virgo. So when we're in this sextile crescent phase right now, I very much like the Rutiar interpretation of that. That's also worked in with Jeff Green And one thing with that crescent phase is there's sort of that idea that, you know, we now know a lot more about what this cycle of meaning is going to be all about for us with Venus and Mars, but we really need to persist forward. And there might be some things kind of pulling us back a little bit, but, you know, at the same time, we can look around and with the sextile forming right now, there's probably some resources available around us to help us out. There's something we're really able to integrate and receive right now about the meaning of this new cycle. But yeah, it's kind of beyond words powerful that we have Mars with Jupiter in Scorpio, you know, with the sextile the Sun, Venus, Pluto. It just makes it so much more dramatic. And even more the case, the fact that we're heading into this year that is going to be so much change is going to happen. And a lot of that's going to really come about through the Mars retrograde and the Venus retrograde. So in June, when Mars stations retrograde in Aquarius, it's going to be in range of a square to basically where Venus later in the year in October stations retrograde in Scorpio. So that's just a really powerful thing to have, that they're going to go retrograde in the same year in these fixed signs squaring one another. There hasn't been a Mars retrograde in Aquarius in a very long time, since I believe like 1971. It's one of the most rare places that Mars goes retrograde. And the other thing is that they're completely lined up with the lunar nodes and Uranus. So Mars in Aquarius is going to be squaring Uranus and Taurus. It's going to, you know, move forward, square Uranus and Taurus, move backwards, square Uranus and Taurus, move forward again, square Uranus and Taurus. And when it's moving backwards in Aquarius, it's going to be moving backwards with the south node of the moon transiting in Aquarius. And it's going to be the supercharged total lunar eclipse lined up exactly with Mars on the moon, on the south node of the moon. And then when Venus goes retrograde, Venus is moving back into Libra. And during that, Venus is going to at first be opposite Uranus, and Venus and Scorpio will be opposite Uranus and Taurus. Uranus is also moving backwards then, and so when Uranus goes back into Aries, Venus will have already moved back into Libra and will be opposite Uranus, and the lunar nodes are switching like at the same time, so we end up with Venus stationing opposite Uranus, squaring the lunar nodes that it will have just turned into Cancer and Capricorn at that time. So it's difficult to know what's going to happen with all of this, except just to say we know things are going to really change. Things are going to probably be really dramatic. It's very easy to imagine, huge protests, things falling apart, really heated conflict, even warfare. I mean, who knows what's going to end up happening? But we know there's lots of change on its way. And so the point we're at right now with our cycle, where they're actually in this nice sextile, it's a supercharged sextile because of all the other planets involved, but it's just a really important time to really just kind of let yourself realize what's going on for you. And also, not to get, I guess I was a little dramatic describing that. It's not something to get, it's really something where we have to really face what's coming. And while there might be some really difficult things collectively on the horizon, these same transits, if you really have the opportunity to engage in something you're really passionate about and really want to work on, there's lots of amazing growth and things you can develop and change and share with other people that could come out through these same transits. One quote I was wanting to share is actually from this. It's included in this book by Brian Clark, where I have a quote here at the bottom about vocation. It's a book on vocation and calling and creativity, which are things we very much associate with Capricorn. And in this book, he includes this quote by Khalil Gibran from the Prophet, which it says, you work that you may keep pace with the earth and the soul of the earth. When you work, you are a flute through whose heart the whispering of the hours turns to music. Work as love made visible. And then at the bottom, there's this quote by Brian Clark, about vocation and, not getting so caught up in this, literal career or job you have, but this idea of your calling being this thing that is really part of the actual calling, and vocation is more about you, kind of unearthing what is that inner gift, or you could use, like soul desire, or this really important passion that you really are here to deliver and share with the greater society and community. And, a lot of times we're unfortunately maybe stuck in jobs or in situations where it's hard to feel that way about that Khalil Gibran quote. And there's often really good reasons we come up with for why we're stuck in those situations, or feel that we're stuck. But this is a really great alignment happening right now, just to start opening your mind to, what is that for you? What does give you that feeling where it's that, it's work, but at the same time, it's really something like that idea of the whispering of the hours turning to music. We're just so engrossed in what you're doing, and it really brings you alive and excitement, and just starting to, at least if you're not in a situation right now where a lot of your hours are occupying that way, just opening yourself up to the potential of that. And what is that for you? And how can you start moving things around in your life and reconfiguring things to give yourself more space to engage in that type of activity? I know I'm getting close to being out of time, although I know we also started late. So I'm a little not sure about where my cutoff is here, but
you're fine. Just
fine. Yeah,
continue on. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I have a few things here that are taken from Jeff Green's work with Capricorn, and also Venus and Capricorn in Evolutionary Astrology. So one of the things he talks about a lot is this idea of, structural change coming from these sort of crystallized levels of reality that, they're really kind of done. It's not working anymore. And what ends up happening is these collective forms and structures, they really just have to break down and fall apart. And with Pluto involved in this right now, and Pluto coming onto its south node right now, we can clearly sense this, going on all around us. This other idea of Capricorn that, gets used in evolutionary astrology a lot is this idea of society and civilization, and Saturn in terms of Saturn and Capricorn in terms of, consensual reality. What are the laws we're all kind of agreeing on? What are the norms? What are the taboos? What are the regulations? And the intention is to create stability. However, the issue that can come up is when people start conforming to these societal norms in a way that, does not actually line up with who they are, ends up becoming very negatively limiting or restrictive. And within this idea of Capricorn in evolutionary astrology is always the idea of the polarity of Cancer, which on this simplest level is just that idea of nurturing, expressing your actual authentic emotional needs and desires. And one of the things in the I think it's the second Pluto book, when Jeff Green's writing about Venus and Capricorn, he writes about this need of people born with Venus and Capricorn to really reflect on the nature of their imprinting by parents, by external authorities, by society, and recreate this new self-image that's liberated from a lot of this conditioning. That was one of the things with Pluto involved in this alignment that I thought was really beautiful about Oprah's speech. Again, that idea of recognizing that now she's on the stage. She was inspired by Sidney Poitier as a young child, and now she's realizing she's putting out this image to kids around the country and even the world who have to battle with oppression and racism or discrimination or sexism, whatever it is, and that she can be this inspiration to kind of open up their mind. And this is something that I think really is open right now. The more you can kind of open your awareness to, just how have you been conditioned, and even in terms of just thinking about the questions you're asking yourself. I was listening to a podcast the other day where they were saying, they were talking about a famous mathematician, and they were saying to them, a great mind is somebody that actually changes the very questions that we ask. And that's, I think, a great thing to be thinking about right now. Just whatever questions you normally ask yourself, what questions you even believe possible are to ask, they're always going to be defining and conditioning the answers you're looking for. And so the more you can just really open yourself up now to letting stuff kind of fall away and letting yourself really feel what wants to emerge out of these transits. And knowing, one thing with Saturn and Capricorn, it's not going to necessarily happen overnight, but Saturn Capricorn likes work, likes following through, likes being dedicated to it. There's an interesting thing too, though, with this where, one thing we think about with Saturn Capricorn is tradition. So it's not like all the things that are old and all these old norms and traditions are bad and we just need to get rid of them. And, there's nothing to learn from the ancestors. There's obviously a lot to learn from the ancestors and traditions. So there's sort of an interesting balancing thing there to play with. But yeah, I think this is just one of the most important things with this right now is just letting yourself really, really feel those feelings, letting yourself start opening your idea of what your life can be to something that you maybe hadn't considered before. And we also talk about Venus with our inner values and what we value. And so you also might notice, as you're paying attention, certain things might not be as valuable to you anymore. Other things might be feeling more valuable. You want to spend more time on these certain things, less time on these certain things. That's all really important thing to be paying attention to. We're immediately going from this into more eclipses. And Venus is actually going to end up being involved in those eclipses coming up because Venus will move into Aquarius and will be going over the south node of the moon as we hit these eclipses. So this alignment is really feeding into the eclipses coming up. So it's definitely good stuff to be thinking about. The south node of Pluto, I don't have enough time to really go into right now. It's something I've been thinking about, and I feel really also have a lot more thinking to do about. But one thing we know is, like I mentioned, the south node of Pluto is really getting activated this year. Later in July, there's going to be a partial solar eclipse in Cancer, in which the solar eclipse is on the north node of Pluto. The solar eclipse itself is exactly opposite Pluto, and Pluto is on its own south node of Pluto at the same time. That 19 to 23 or so degree range of Capricorn, that's where as far as the heliocentric nodes, and the geocentric nodes can vary a little bit more, but that's kind of like the center of where those south nodes of Saturn and Pluto are located. And as I mentioned before, we're heading towards that 2020 conjunction of Saturn and Pluto right now with them balsamic to one another. And that's going to be right on the south node of Saturn. as well as close to the south node of Pluto. Down there at the bottom, I have a quote from Mark Jones, which I think does a nice job kind of pulling all together the way the nodes of Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto, and Capricorn have been interpreted by people that are into the work of Jeff Green and evolutionary astrology. And so there's certainly a lot about civilization and the civilizations we've been living in, the oppression of the patriarchy, oppressive systems of power. You know, how are we even going to survive on this planet? How are we going to, you know, be able to come together and actually unite and work on positive things and, you know, help each other survive and even ideally thrive. And, you know, all this is really coming up. And I mean, even if you just even look at the last times Pluto has hit its nodes, there have been some pretty difficult times. Like when Pluto was at its north node last, which is sort of the 1920s going into the 1930s, it's basically right when we went into the Great Depression in the United States and like the stock market crash and all that. And, you know, which led, and there's difficult economic situation in other places. It unfortunately ended up leading into another world war eventually. But that was obviously a very crucial time as far as figuring out how we're going to deal with this. And, you know, and if we look the previous time Pluto was where it's at now, on its own south node, that's basically, in the United States, that's kind of the build up to the actual Revolutionary War and the War of Independence, where there's a lot of other really, you know, volatile things going on. So this really is an alignment right now where, you know, everybody needs to really just show up with what you're here to do. You know, the more people can have that courage to really break out with what they really want to do, what kind of gifts they have, the more we can all be doing that, you know, the better. And we'll just see what ends up coming across in these next years. But it's definitely a really the fact that this Venus Sun alignment is just dialed into Pluto, and this idea of Pluto on its south node just makes it all the more powerful, and just really big realizations can be coming out of this. I had another thing I was maybe going to do, which I think I honestly don't have time to do. I just kind of had another thing I was maybe going to go into because I wasn't sure how long that was all going to take. So I think I'm going to actually skip over this last part. I was going to maybe talk a little bit about the Eros and Psyche story. When I wrote about Venus retrograde in Capricorn 4 years ago, I worked in this story a little bit. I think it's probably going to take us too far into over time if I go into that right now.
Would you like to take a question?
Yeah, I can take any questions that people have.
Okay,
yeah.
Lauren, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Great, thank you. This is so fascinating. I have a question for you regarding, I think it was October 16 that Mars and Venus are both out of bounds together, which is really rare. And I'm just wondering, what do you imagine the significance is to both of these going retrograde together?
Yeah, so that the out of bounds part, that was not something that I was honestly paying attention to. But that would be really interesting if it was that October 16th time, because that would have been around the beginning of the cycle. So if they went out of bounds, then I guess to me that just sort of, that would play up kind of that seed. That's sort of like the seeding phase of their new cycle. Yeah, and planets going out of bounds can just be much more extreme and unconventional in expression, yeah, and that's certainly what we're going to be seeing in the year ahead. I mean, Mars retrograde and Venus retrograde are both associated with unconventional things going against the normal societal conventions. So that's going to be even more the case, most likely, since Uranus is involved in them, and that the eclipses that are happening, and there's a lot of lunations that are just really lined up with them too in this kind of crazy way. I mean, one thing that made me think about, we're already kind of seeing this with a lot of things shifting with, I mean, if you think about which, you know, I know some people don't like associating Mars and Venus with genders and males and females, but that is a traditional astrology idea. And there's certainly been already within the cycle of Mars and Venus already we've seen some really dramatic shifts in male-female relationships, especially in women being much more empowered, speaking out about you know, abuse and molestation and predatory behavior with men, and so there's already something underway about a lot of, I think, reshifting of ideally of healthy boundaries and relationship dynamics, and things coming to light that hopefully will feed into some shifts. I would imagine there's going to be yeah, I mean, one thing that I would imagine would just be a lot more, I mean, the things that we're already seeing that are really difficult for people, and people really struggling economically and having a hard time. I mean, it's unlikely anything's going to really change that. And so people might get more pushed to also kind of speak out more and protest more and organize more and fight to change things, I would also be guessing. If there's any other questions about anything? If not, I'll just leave it with a short little plug here at the end for this astrology course I'm going to be teaching with my partner, June Rose, at the end of January. And if you're interested in this at all, just reach out to me. You can send me an email and I can answer any questions you have about it. I have information on my website. We're going to have like webinar classes, and each Sunday, actually not every Sunday, but there's 10 of them in that January 21st to April 8th time period. And then some Zoom meetings like in between where we can answer people's questions. And yeah, so if you're interested in that at all, if you've been, it's kind of designed for people hopefully open to people that are at a more beginning level, won't be lost. It's honestly probably more intermediate to farther along than that level. But we're trying to do in the way so people that are at a more beginning stage won't just be totally lost, which is often a difficult thing for people when they're learning. But we're definitely going to kind of go through just really foundational, fundamental astrology concepts in the class. Yeah, any other questions or comments? If not, I can kind of end there.
That was wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If I can stop, should I stop
Yeah,
sharing?
go ahead and stop share.
Okay, cool. Yeah, let's try to stop recording. Okay, cool.
Okay, well, if there's no other questions, then could you all please thank Gray Crawford?
Cool, thank you.
Thanks again.
That was really interesting.
Cool, thank you.
Thank
You're
you.
a wonderful astrologer, Gray. You're a wonderful astrologer. So good to hear.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.